You're listening to Tehachapod with Key Budge, Corey Costello, and Greg Garrett.
It is Tehachapod time again. Key Budge, Greg Garrett, Corey Costello. Gentlemen, how are you today?
Doing good, Key.
Fantastic.
We've just come out of Memorial Day. Greg, you and I worked together. We announced the parade, and the response from the community to come out and honor our military, those that have fallen, it was impressive.
I think it was a very special Memorial Day to kind of sit back and for a moment think about all of the fallen soldiers that have gone before. And it was a momentous time. And you talk about we participated in the parade. You announced the parade. I was there. I did a little bit. I'm not that guy. I tried really hard. Corey, you would have been embarrassed by me, actually.
Yeah,
but
that's why I didn't show. Just no chance.
But all of the participants and the people, spectators, it was a great parade.
Yeah.
It was a very busy weekend in Tehachapi.
The sense of patriotism that I took away, I felt that. The honoring those that have fallen, and just a fantastic job by our American Legion and other veteran organizations that put that together. We just played an assist role, and it was so well attended that I'm just very pleased with the Tehachapi community.
And the ceremony at Central Park after the parade, very well attended. Great speakers, the folding of the flag, the singing of the national anthem, just on and on. It went very well.
And arguably, it was probably the busiest Memorial Day weekend that we've ever had, with all the events between what was happening on Memorial Day with the Legion and the other organizations, plus the Stoll event, which we covered on this show. They had a couple days worth of activities, and the Western Swing Out had a couple days of activities throughout downtown with the VFW, Four Seasons Cafe. They were involved, so it was a lot happening in a short amount of time.
And a little thing called the wind.
It showed up too.
It was so windy, or maybe not. I don't even. Did anybody notice? Because it's always windy in Tehachapi.
It seemed it's been so.
It was the chill that came with it.
Yeah.
I think that was what spoke out here on Memorial Day. And I know we've had those kind of days here as we kick off summer, and we'll still get those cool events and maybe a rainstorm or something that'll kind of.
Well, when's high school graduation next week?
Yeah, so it should get really cold.
It'll get really cold for about 2 days right around high school graduation,
and then summer will hit.
Set your watch to it. Yeah.
Well, as we join together today, this was today's topic. Our special guest is Jon Hammond. So, Jon, let me just welcome you to the show because we've already got you mic'd up. So, welcome to Tehachapod.
Thanks, Keith.
It's nice to have you because we've been talking, Greg, Corey, and I, as we do different events and we see things. And Corey found some then photos.
Yeah.
And these are some historic photos around town. And then I went out and shot the now photos, try to recapture some of these moments, same spot, and look at the change. And then we started having the conversation about what historically is coming. And we happened to stumble upon a documentary being filmed about the 1952 Tehachapi earthquake. And they were putting this together. That'll be coming out sometime soon. And we thought, we need to talk about this. It's the 70th anniversary of this huge event that took place. And then we thought, who better than to bring our historian, one of our historians here for Tehachapi, Jon Hammond. And Jon was like, yeah, let's talk about it.
And if folks don't know exactly what Jon does, let's put it in this perspective. Before we had Google, we just asked Jon Hammond about Tehachapi stuff, because literally this is a walking database of Tehachapi history, knowledge, nature, go on and on.
Well, he still knows more than Google when it comes to Tehachapi.
Yes, exactly.
There's no doubt about it.
For those that aren't familiar with your work, and if you haven't picked up either the Loop community newspaper or the Tehachapi News, because Jon writes a piece for each edition that's in there, your family history, I didn't know this just before we went on, your family history here in Tehachapi dates back how far?
My grandfather came through in 1898, 5,000 goats. He was working as a shepherd, and there was a shearing station at Cameron where that boat says SS Minnow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That was a dairy, and it's called the Cameron Dairy, a small dairy. They had 6 cows or 8 cows. And they used to have sheep sheared there because it was a railroad. There was actually a depot there, and they would load wool and mohair from the goats there. So they had big 10-foot tall burlap bags, and they would bring big bands of sheep and some goats there, and they would shear them, and then they would load the wool or the mohair in these big burlap bags and put them on the railroad and send them to woolen mills back in the Midwest, and they would be spun into fabric. And so he came through, and he liked Tehachapi. He talked about in letters he wrote to his mother about how the sheep shearers would work really hard, and they would go spend some of their money at the saloons in Tehachapi because there was lots of them.
5,000 goats?
Yeah,
How many
5,000
people
goats.
did he have helping him?
There was just 3 of them usually, sometimes 2.
Holy moly. I
and-
can't imagine even
And these
what.
were Angora goats, so they had long hair. They used to make like mohair, almost cashmere in a sense. They did well in the desert because they're normally a desert animal. And he wrote meticulous letters back to his mother, and she saved him. So we have this great record of what it was like to be a shepherd in the late 1800s on the Mojave Desert. So he became familiar with the area that way. And then in 1921, there was a grocery store in Pasadena called the Model Grocery. It was like the big grocery store there. And people used to sometimes phone in their grocery orders and run up a tab. Well, the guy ran up a tab he couldn't pay. He had some financial reversals, and the Model Grocery didn't want to be in the property owning business, but he gave them 10 acres in Tehachapi to satisfy his grocery bill. And at that time, it was a 10-hour drive from LA to Tehachapi because all dirt roads and gravel roads. And so they said whoever paid off his $256 grocery bill could have the 10 acres in Tehachapi. So my grandfather's sisters and one of their husbands, they put their money together and did that. So they got a little farm in Tehachapi in 1921.
There you go. There's another little tidbit, right? Make a Google, make a Jon Hammond. I mean, honestly, I've been to John's house, and actually it's like a museum also. His barn and all these artifacts, it rivals the Heritage Museum on Green Street. I mean, all of this data in his head and all of these artifacts in his home is quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's kind of like time hasn't changed much there at the place from the 20s
and you look
30s.
The same from junior high, John.
Mother always said I had a face made for radio.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, John, we wanted to talk about the 52 earthquake here in Tehachapi. You know, as I kind of mentioned earlier, Corey and I were sharing some photos, and if you go into Kelsey's, you can see photos.
We even have older stuff, you know, the city through the Heritage League as well, you know, came across great shots of Green Street and the beautiful brick buildings. And Greg and I even talk about it like, gosh, we wish this building was still here because how cool would this building have been? You know, red brick standing on the corner and you know, it all that unreinforced masonry came tumbling down. And that was we still have really ramifications from that earthquake today. I mean, in our building codes, why we only allow a certain amount of stories downtown. Those are things that all came as a result of the 52 earthquake and the loss of life and the loss of property in that earthquake.
Yeah, it was a transformative event for sure, and not just the fact that it knocked down buildings, but no one in Tehachapi was expecting there would be an earthquake because that little fault, the White Wolf Fault, which runs along the backside of Bear Mountain, had been documented decades earlier, but it only runs about 34 miles, and it was just thought to be this little old extinct, short fragmented fault. And then just before 5 a.m. on July 21st, the town was shaken awake by this earthquake that registered 7.7 on the Richter scale. It's attributed, they said that 11 lives were lost, but there's actually, I spoke with a man he was driving in a vehicle past the railroad tower. There was a water tower at the railroad park, and it was only about 2/3 full, and it started sloshing, and it tipped this big water tank, and it sent a wall of water across Tehachapi Boulevard. It blew out the windows of what was then called Economy Mercantile. It was owned by the Catullas family, later became Catullas Department Store. But he was in his car and his wife was asleep in the back. It was like a van, and she got injured, and he said she later died from those injuries. So the official death toll is 11, but it could be 12.
Probably rose, afterwards, yeah. Wow, so I was thinking about, Key, remember when we had a podcast about the earthquake out in Ridgecrest some time ago, and a little-known fault. And so these little-known faults are the ones that are the sleeping giants. You know, we have the San Andreas that runs up and down the length of the state somewhat. And people always think, oh, the big one in San Andreas, it's going to zip apart, right? We're going to become 2 states. But these little faults are the ones that can cause some significant damage to communities like Tehachapi.
Think about 7.7 in the 50s, too. I mean, that's... You know, Ridgecrest was 7, I don't want to mess this up, but 3 or 2 on the big one?
I think 7.3 or 7.
With minimal damage, with the exception of the larger, older buildings on the base, which were built in the 40s.
Because of new building standards.
Yeah. So 7.7 in 1952 was, that was a life changer.
Yeah, and the Richter scale it's kind of deceiving to people because it's an order of magnitude, each number you go up. So an earthquake that's say 8 on the Richter scale is not twice as strong as one that's 4. It's 10,000 times stronger than one that's a 4. So people think that one that's like, 5, well, it's not that much more than a 4. I go, yeah, it's 10 times more than that. So it was a massive earthquake. It was felt over 160,000 square miles. And of course, it did the most damage in Tehachapi, but it also did some damage in Arvin, damaged some structures. But in Tehachapi, the main damage was downtown because of all the unreinforced masonry that did tumble into the streets. Vaughn Squires owned a drugstore, which is where Gallery and Gifts is today, on the corner of Tehachapi Boulevard and Green Street. And he was awakened by the earthquake, of course, like everybody. And he jumped up and was hurrying down to check his store. And he was partway down and he realized he didn't bring his keys. He thought, I should go back and get my keys. Well, he decided to go on ahead, which when he got there, he saw it didn't matter because the building, the whole front was falling into the street and the windows were broken. So he didn't need a key to get in his business.
And that created those issues too. I mean, we have stories going back to even not only Tehachapi, but Bakersfield as well. We didn't have much of a highway system at that point. So the roads were blocked. I know 99 was blocked in Gorman because of a rock slide. The railroad was really messed up and offset. So that was out. So the access was an issue. I remember talking to someone years ago and they told a story that they had folks that were sort of stuck coming from the Mojave area and they basically got on horseback and rode Cameron Canyon into Tehachapi to figure out, okay, what can we do? How can we help? That was really the only way to get anything in for a while.
Yeah, there was even one of the fatalities was a 16-year-old girl named Florence Fillmore, and she was at the Delman Bright Ranch in Bright Valley, and she was sleeping in a milk house. And she usually would have a water tank above, and it would be a stone structure or concrete that would support the water tank. And unfortunately, it collapsed and killed her. And the people she was staying with, they put her body in the back of a pickup truck and were returning it to her family in L.A. They're kind of like panicking, and they had to be turned around at Willow Springs Road, and they said, no, you have to have a coroner come out, and you have to, even though there is an earthquake, no one's denying there's an earthquake, you still, if someone's lost their life, it has to be investigated. You can't just remove them. So they were sent back to Bright Valley. But most of the fatalities were at a secondhand store on Tehachapi Boulevard where it collapsed down in the basement, and there was a family with a number of children who were sleeping down in the basement. And that's where the main loss of life came from.
We had a lot of that too. A lot of you bring up the basements. Some of those are still sort of in existence. I mean, they're not really habitable, but I know some of the buildings were built on top. Currently, I've talked to people, they're like, yeah, I got this weird basement underneath me, and those are part of the original structures. And some of that stuff, some of the vaults and things that are around are still there underneath the street, but those were part of the old buildings.
Yeah, and they were root cellars, really. I mean, they were used for food storage, and some of them were before refrigeration even. There was a really cool one at the Jeffers place, Jeffrey Road, that connects to Old Town Road. It actually was named after a family named Jeffers. It was just like many street names that gets it wrong. Like Bert Dennison, for whom Dennison is named, didn't have two N's in his name next to each other. But
sounds like Ellis Island. When you're coming over from Europe, the old country, it's what do you say? What can you spell? How does it sound?
Yeah. Costello, right here with an E on the end.
Yeah, right.
That was not done. That was done at Ellis Island with a stroke of a pen by the guy who said, what's your name? And what's an Irish immigrant going to do? Fight with the U.S.? No, you accept it and you move on.
Yeah. There was a friend of mine that lived in Tehachapi, Anthony McDemus. People assumed he was Irish because he has an Irish last name. His family were Greek, and his grandfather's name was Macrodemetrius, which means Big Thomas in Greek. And he got to Ellis Island, and they asked his name and said, Macrodemetrius. I go, McDemus it is.
That's why probably most of us are Smith and Jones. Yeah. Because it was just easier.
Yeah. Simple.
Going back to with the earthquake, do you know what the population was back in 52? I mean, now we're about just under 40,000 currently
in the community,
in the zip code. Yeah.
The city was about 2,000.
Yeah, the city was that's what the figure I hear used the most is 2,000, with another 500 in the outlying area. And there wasn't much damage in the outlying area because mostly were frame structures and they just gave with the earthquake. Well, with one exception, the Cummings Valley School was totally destroyed. And there would have been fatalities of school children had school been in session, but it was so early. That's what kept the casualty count down, was not that many people were out and about at 5 o'clock in the morning. There was one guy they initially thought was another fatality. There was a big building right across from the parking lot of the old Jacobson Junior High, which is now partially Saracoso College. Right across their parking lot across Tehachapi Boulevard, which was a later place called Clouds Precast. But there was a building there was part of the Summit Lime Company. They would bring limestone down from the limestone mine up in the mountains, and they would store it there before putting it on the railroad. And it was kind of damaged, and there was a body there, but it turned out it was a a local guy who was drunk and he was just hungover. So he recovered and he slept through the earthquake.
Can you imagine the guy who was investigating that death, as you pointed out earlier, right? And all of a sudden he just sobers up and stands up. Can you imagine that story?
Yeah.
Yeah, he probably woke up and thought, what the heck? What just went on? That was some good whiskey.
Yeah. His nickname was Okey Doke. They called him Okey Doke, but they go, Okey Doke was killed. And they go, oh no, he's okay.
He's just sleeping it off. He's just sleeping one
It
off.
sounds like a Twilight Zone or something. Like we thought he was dead, you know. But you know, KTLA Channel 5, they came out here, and I think that was one of the first kind of remote broadcasts. And I'm not sure how they did it back then because we didn't have satellites, but just bing, bing, bing antennas, and they got some kind of broadcast from here to Los Angeles.
They came out in 52?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And then the governor at the time, Earl Warren, came and visited Tehachapi. Tehachapi didn't get a lot of assistance, though, as it turned out. There was nowadays, usually when a community has a disaster, there's an emergency declaration and funds are made available, but that didn't happen for Tehachapi.
Well, that makes my point and our point at the city of Tehachapi. We continue to promote the fact that we should be self-reliant. Yeah. Don't count on the county, don't count on the state, don't count on the federal government. These days, they do, you know, when there's an emergency, a lot of people will come. I know in Ridgecrest, there was a lot of resources made available to them.
They were isolated. It was only Ridgecrest.
And thank God for that. But still, you always need to be prepared, whether it's with your finances or your public safety or anything, emergency preparation. You need to be prepared locally, and it's all about community at the end of the day. Because if you think big government's going to take care of you, you're wrong. Yeah. We need to be self-sufficient.
Yeah, we saw a lot of, you see a lot of that too. In the aftermath stories, to your point of just it was a neighbor helping neighbor clean up, that sort of thing, because that assistance just wasn't coming.
Yeah, farmers brought their tractors to help clear the streets. You look at those old photographs. My grandmother took a number of color slides of that day, and there's not that many color images because color film was relatively new. You couldn't get color prints, but you could make color transparencies or slides. And so her camera was back in Kern River, South Fork Valley. And so my grandfather went, he had a hard time getting there because the LA Aqueduct had broken in a few places and washed out the roads. But he went up over 178 and got her camera and brought it back. And so she took color slides of the damage that day. One of the famous photographs is a car that was crushed by falling bricks, but none of the tires were popped. And they had Goodyear tires. So Goodyear used that in a full-page ad, I think in Life magazine, a year later, showing how strong these tires were.
Great marketing.
The car could get crushed and the tires didn't pop.
Wow. I've seen some pretty crazy photos of the railroad, of the way the tracks just twist and the tunnels that were collapsed. And
yeah, getting the line open, because even to this day, Tehachapi is considered the busiest section of single-track mountain railroad in the world. There's most of the parts we see wherever there's crossings, of course, is double track. In the town of Tehachapi, is double track, and there's many sidings that are double track, but the rest of it is single track. The tunnels, they're all single track. And the effort that Southern Pacific Railroad put into restoring the train tracks and getting the line open again was the biggest expenditure of money and manpower that they had done since the railroad was completed in Tehachapi in 1876. So this is 70 years later. They had this massive work crew with lots of money and lots of time was spent working around the clock to get the railroad back open. And they got it open in about a month because it was just so important. The Tehachapi rail line is such a vital link that they...
Well, you think about back then, too, it was muscles, manpower, mules, different things. They didn't have the giant equipment that we have these days necessarily. Big cranes, obviously they had equipment, but not at their fingertips like they do today.
No. And they, like I said, they sent workers from all over to get the railroad back open again. That was and the earthquake had effects that people don't really think about as much. Like there used to be hotels in Tehachapi. A number of them would have like 8 or 10 rooms, and there would be retail space down below and then a hotel up above. And some of the photos show where the walls peeled away, you can see the beds. There was actually a man sleeping in one of the beds. One of the bed legs is outside the building, leaning there. There was a guy sleeping in that bed when that happened. But those all went away after the earthquake, and they were replaced with motels, with single-story motor lodges. And Tehachapi also had a switchboard operator system, telephone system at the time. The switchboard's office was located where Kelsey's restaurant, now it's Sheridan's Consignments, but in that particular spot on Tehachapi Boulevard. And it was all damaged. They went out and they managed to run a line off the railroad line. And so the operator who was on duty at the time, Ada McLaughlin, she was in a house coat when the earthquake hit, and she went outside and they set a table there and they would allow residents one phone call. It's like being arrested. They could have one phone call to let a family member know that they were okay. And a lot of times the phone line was being used to organize relief efforts. And then she said at the end of the day, she looked down, she still had her house coat on. She'd never had time to change, but that was the only phone line out of Tehachapi for quite a while. So the phone company had a switchboard, had a direct dial system that they were going to give to the city of Delano, but because the system was so damaged in Tehachapi, they ended up switching. So Tehachapi got eliminated the old switchboard operator system probably 10 or 20 years sooner than it would have been, because of the earthquake. And the phone company they temporarily set up the office where now it's Family Life Pregnancy Center. It was called the Oddfellows Hall. They set it upstairs there, and they sent a man from Bakersfield to stay with the women who were the operators to make them feel safer when there was aftershocks, because there was 99 aftershocks that registered 4.0 or greater on the Richter scale. So you could definitely feel them. And Pat Gracie, who was one of the operators, said that man from Bakersfield was the first person out the door if there was the slightest tremor, and the Tehachapi women just stayed and worked or went out more leisurely.
So the Family Life Pregnancy Center, it survived the earthquake. So that must.
That was going to be my next question. What were the other? Oddfellows Hall was one of them.
The BK Theater had very little damage. The BK Theater was like almost unscathed. It made people so nervous about future building that the Masonic Lodge, which is now the Tehachapi branch of the Kern County Library, was one of the first new structures built, and it looked like a bunker. I mean, the windows are like rifle ports originally. I mean, they've replaced them with very nice windows now, but people were so traumatized by the experience of the earthquake and what it had done that the buildings after that had lots of reinforcement, very thick walls and lots of concrete. And it made like a bond among the people who lived through that.
Well, the hospital was the same way too. When they rebuilt it, what was the old that just got torn down. I remember when they were tearing it down, they were like, "This is pour in place cast concrete. This is almost a bomb shelter that was built as a hospital." To your point,
right? That's one of the reasons why it was not very feasible to remodel it into something else, because the hospital had been located in an old boarding house, an old 2-story boarding house. It was a Captiville boarding house. Then a husband and wife team, Harold and Madge Schlotthauer, had bought it, converted it into a hospital, and that's where it was the morning of the quake. They moved patients out onto the hospital grounds. There's photographs. You can see them in their hospital beds on the lawn outside the hospital. And then, so it was torn down. The new plans, some of them called for the removal of those 2 large deodar cedar trees. And Dr. Schlotthauer told the architect, no, I want those trees saved. And then he argued with them and said, well, it would be a lot more efficient use of space if we just removed those. And finally, they called him Dr. Harold, said, either design a hospital around these trees or I'll find a different architect who can. So the trees ended up staying, but the hospital ended up being, like Corey said, these poured walls, like a prison. And so it made it very difficult, even in what would normally be interior walls, to convert that building to something else. So that's why the decision was made to level it and then replace it with something better.
You know, Key, John said something earlier about that one phone call out. I was thinking about emergency preparedness. We've talked about this before, but I think it's worth repeating. You might think about, and Key, I think you have this process already within your family. If something happens in Tehachapi, there's going to be limited phone service. You might want to have a process where you can call somebody outside of town, whether it's in LA or Vegas or Frisco, wherever, and make contact with that family member and tell them, we're okay, we'll contact you when we can, or something of the sort, right? Because I think, learning from the 1952 earthquake, we've learned a lot about processes and code enforcement and, building safety, those sorts of things, but also communications out, right? You need to have a process in your own circle.
Yeah, communication plan for emergencies is really the first thing that you need to put together with your family. And it's a lot easier to communicate outside of the area in most emergencies, like an earthquake, that it's easier to get that outside line to someone maybe in LA or across the country, a family member, and you can use that as the check-in point. If it's someone here local where I'm trying to contact my wife across town, the lines are going to be busy. The data is going to be down with cell service and things. So having that out of the area contact is really critical. And then knowing that everyone should reach out to that person is one of those things we teach in the emergency preparedness planning. But having a communication plan, I think that's really what you were talking about, Greg, is have a plan in place.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to another aspect, another one of those kind of stories. We had, at the time, a women's prison out in the Cummings Valley. And so there was obviously a huge impact to that area. There's like over 400 inmates at the time. And so there was quite a bit of a scramble to get them sort of accommodated after the earthquake.
Yeah, they had built that prison. It was supposed to be an experiment in rehabilitation, and it really was. They built it looked more like a campus, like a college, like a East Coast college campus than it did like a prison. The only people with weapons were a couple men at the gate. One of my great aunts was called him a matron. She was now it'd be like a correctional officer, but they call her a matron. She worked out there, and the women were given fabric and they could make their own clothes, so they didn't have like a regimented uniform, and they were organized into like houses that way. It wasn't just minimum security either. There was women the women's prison was open from 1932 to 1952. And there were women who went from Tehachapi and were executed in the electric chair. So it wasn't that there was only like it was just a minimum security facility. It was one of only a couple women's facilities in the state of California. And so when it was damaged, they housed the women in tents on the prison grounds throughout the summer. It happened in the summer, fortunately. And then they moved them to a prison in Frontera. And when they reopened the prison, it was as a men's prison. It's been a men's prison ever since. But it's one of the unfortunate casualties of that earthquake that method of incarceration was different. And it was very relaxed. My great aunt even took my mom when she was 12. She would take her to work with her sometimes because many of those women were mothers and they didn't get to see their children very much. So they were very friendly and respectful to my mom. And so that's how laid back it was. Like you could actually bring a child it was a women's prison, and it was relaxed, and my mom said the inmates were very nice to her, and she liked going and visiting the women's prison in Tehachapi. But you can still hear it mentioned in old movies. They'll threaten a female protagonist with like, when I catch you and see what you've done, you'll go to Tehachapi for this.
You brought up the fact that this happened in the summer. Did that potentially, because you got to think, pre-air conditioning, that kind of stuff. A lot of folks, there was porches on homes. People slept outside, even especially in Metro Bakersfield. I know there's some of those old, you go to the Oleander area, the really old downtown. There's giant front porches because that's where people slept because it was too hot to be inside the house. So could that maybe minimize some of the fatalities, that sort of thing? People sleeping more outside?
It could have, and it also, once it happened, then like most of the town moved outside because they slept outside all that summer until they got confident enough, because there was all these aftershocks. So once you've experienced a very powerful earthquake, then you feel another one starting. It seems like it's happening again. So there was 99 of them. We read about earthquakes that are 4 point something, and we'll read about those in the newspaper. They'll have them online about there was this pretty good earthquake that was 4 point something. Well, Tehachapi had 99 aftershocks that were 4.0 or greater. So people lived with earthquake sensation for quite a while afterwards. And like I said, we're slept outside. That's one of the things that bonded people. Like if you lived through the earthquake, like you spent the rest of July and August, maybe in September, sleeping outside. Most people did. They go inside to cook and stuff, but they would sleep outside. Another thing, it had been very hot. It was July 21st, so it's not unusual, but it happened to be very still and hot before the earthquake, and then it hit. And so it's a phenomenon you can read about. People
Earthquake weather.
And
I know you hear about that. I was thinking when we were talking about Memorial Day, it was cold and windy. I thought, well, that's not earthquake weather. We have to wait until it's hot and stagnant.
Yeah, and seismologists will say there's no correlation. Earthquakes happen when they happen, and it's deep within the earth, and it's not impacted by weather. But if you were someone who lived through the Tehachapi earthquake, or even were raised by people who did, like Tehachapi people, longtime Tehachapi people know the term earthquake weather, and when it's really calm and kind of oppressive and muggy, it feels like earthquake weather.
I know it, right? Ooh, keep the wind blowing.
Well, and then they talk about the animals sort of predicting it by their behavior. Horses are acting weird, and and then all of a sudden there's an event.
Yeah, and there was that. And that actually is the earthquake weather thing. There's been no cause and effect ever been shown, no correlation. But the animals perceiving disruption before people. My uncle said that he had pigs and sheep and chickens, and he reported the animals acting funny. People talked about some dogs had run away the day before that had never run away.
The birds go silent. But scientists, they'll tell you, don't drink coffee, drink coffee, don't eat broccoli, broccoli, don't eat eggs.
Only smoke eggs. Chesterfield cigarettes. They're best for you, according to your doctor. Yeah.
Right. And so I'm like, whatever. I
wouldn't like if your dog runs away when an earthquake is imminent. But in hindsight, people made the connection. They said, like, I hadn't seen them do that before, and they did that before the earthquake.
I think Mother Earth knows what's going on.
Yeah.
She's living and breathing too. So there's a connection. I'm sure of it.
John, have you written about this historic earthquake? You've written about so many things. Every time I open the paper, I learn something about, whether it's wildlife or, nature, plant life. Have you ever written about this earthquake?
I've written about the earthquake, yeah. Like, times when July 21st rolls around. Like there's a spot out by where I live on Sage Lane that became an informal dump where people dumped all the things from their house that got damaged because it broke tens of thousands of dishes and things. So out here at this dump, there's all these broken glass and broken dishes, and it's all from about the same era, the 1950s. Some of the things are older because people had older items in their homes, but that's when they're all deposited right along Sage Lane. In this field now it was just suddenly, and it was not used for years after that, but just that one time everyone had to get rid of stuff because everyone's house had broken things in them.
There's a couple of those in the city as well. Former sites or
burn dumps,
burn dumps, or even just some of the masonry that was damaged got thrown over the side of a hill down by the railroad, and that's where it's still underground today.
Yeah.
Now, we don't want people digging around trying to find an artifact.
Being very, very.
But we're not going to tell you where they are.
Yeah, and most of it's just bricks. It was just stuff that was damaged and no longer usable.
That's the one of that other site was everything was broken before it was thrown there.
Right.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, there used to be a burn dump up Curry.
Don't tell anyone what it is. Just generalize. Just generalize.
But if it was burned, that's all right.
It seems freakish now, but you would go and dump things there, and then you would light your own fire yourself. Yeah. That was your responsibility. You dump the stuff, and you would bring some newspaper, and you would light your trash on fire, and then drive away. Well, there was no law. There was nothing saying you had to stay there till it was out. That wasn't part of it at all. It was kind of around by bare dirt, but there would be these smoldering piles from earlier people and earlier in the day or the day before. And I remember being a kid, loving to go there because
you could just dig around. You would find such cool stuff.
And it was this post-apocalyptic scene of this charred, and things that are metal don't always burn up, so you could find some cool stuff there. So I just think that's one of the things I think about about how life has changed. I go,
and now we have to separate everything.
Well, walk the alleys downtown.
Everything.
Walk the alleys downtown. You'll find these what look like fireplaces still facing out of some of the older homes. That was your trash service. You just lit it on fire.
Yeah, people take 55-gallon drums and punch a couple holes in the bottom to serve as a draft, and then put a screen on top to keep papers from blowing away. And many people had burn barrels
right in their backyard.
I can't imagine what that scene was like post the earthquake, as people are dumping stuff. But there must have been fires everywhere as people are burning the stuff they're pulling out of their homes. It wasn't good anymore. It's not like you had somebody just pick it up and haul it away like we do now. So I can't imagine that was. That was probably a talk about post-apocalyptic. You probably had burns going everywhere.
Yeah, there was no trash service in the city of Tehachapi in 1952. You took care of it yourself.
Now, since 52, what's because I ask you this not because you're old enough to go back to 52, but you have seen the photographs. You've gone through the changes since 1952. What are some of those things that you've noticed here in downtown that are very similar? You mentioned a couple of buildings that still exist, but I'm kind of intrigued by the changes.
Yeah, well, it did have an effect on everybody who was there, and so the buildings did reflect that. They weren't as creative. They looked more like square kind of boxes, and they were just concerned about earthquake after that. It said they got rid of those little 2-story hotels and replaced them with motels around town. Went from switchboard operator to direct dial. As far as the buildings around downtown, people began to, when it came back, it did prompt kind of a revival in Tehachapi, and it was, like I said, it was all business people doing it on their own. Because Dick Johnson one time, he went to track down Tehachapi get any money for the earthquake, and all he could find was some money that went to the Red Cross and didn't necessarily go specifically to Tehachapi. There was a few churches that got some assistance, like the Apostolic Faith Church, a little congregation there on C Street and Curry. They had a very old church building, and it was damaged, and they got assistance with donations to build the building that's there now. So there was private donations, but
there was no FEMA. FEMA didn't come in.
No, there was none of that.
Was that building? I'm curious. What is now Pierce Renewables, WWS, was that a pre-earthquake building? I'm trying to remember, because I know when the Cummings purchased it and renovated it, they had to reinforce the masonry inside of it.
Yeah, no, that was actually built as a bowling alley. Mm-hmm. That was actually a bowling alley, and they had hand pin setters. There was a little 4-lane bowling alley when it was originally built. Okay. And so, it was prior to the earthquake.
Okay, gotcha. Because I think if you go, and that's what I assume when you go in there, because they expose the brick. And when you go into some of the offices,
Yeah.
you could see cracks, and they'd been filled in, but it was, I mean, you want to talk about building character. Now it's all been reinforced since to meet new California code, but it's still really cool. I mean, you can really see the damages from the quake, you know, in that building specifically.
Yeah, and the packing sheds along Tehachapi Boulevard, they predated the earthquake, where Conan's Bakery is now, and the apple shed or the shed, those structures predated it. There was a few frame houses that got actually knocked off their foundation so much, a few were torn down. Most of them, like they just gave with the quake. It wasn't the most disruptive in the motion, because quakes move. Some quakes do a lot of slip shifting, and some do a lot of up thrusting like that. But the Tehachapi earthquake, for as powerful it was, could have been a lot more destructive. It was thought initially that Bear Mountain had gained 10 feet in elevation. Later, it was determined that that was a little bit more. I mean, it wasn't quite as substantial, but it still gained 3 feet in elevation the morning of the quake. Bear Mountain did.
Can you imagine the force to lift that?
Bear Mountain, 3 feet.
Holy moly!
Yeah.
Looking at the estimates at $1952, $60 million in damage. That's, I mean, can you imagine what that would be today?
Well, an interesting thing is that the highest dollar impact, the damage caused by the earthquake, was not to the city of Tehachapi or the buildings, but it was to irrigated crops in the southern San Joaquin Valley, because it ruined so many wells and pipelines. And on July 21st down there, you know, the weather is over 100 every day, and there just simply wasn't time enough to get irrigation systems reestablished. So tens of millions of dollars in 1952 dollars were lost in the southern San Joaquin to farm crops.
Wow.
Yeah. Speaking of force, and there was a 20th anniversary, or a story written about 20 years ago in the LA Times that talked about it, and they said, they quoted a Caltech seismologist who said the thrust of the Tehachapi earthquake was equal to 1,000 billion horsepower engines running for 1 hour. That was the force. I can't even fathom that.
Difficult to imagine.
Yeah, I can't even fathom that number.
What'd you say? 1,000
1,000
billion.
1,000 billion horsepower engines
That's a big number.
running for an hour. That's a lot of horsepower. Yeah, that's a lot of horsepower.
John, what motivates you when you're out writing? And not specifically here about the earthquake, but the other things, because I get fascinated by the topics and things that you pick. What motivates you when it's time to put pen to paper?
I'm just a curious person, and so I like to, when I learn new things, I like to share those with other people, because a lot of times people would appreciate things more if they understand them. If you don't understand them, it's difficult to appreciate something if you don't really know anything about it. If you drive past and all the trees are just trees, or the birds are just nameless birds flying, it's hard to feel much kinship or to really care about their fate or just understand and appreciate them. And so I love Tehachapi and the history and the culture and the wildlife and the plants. And when I go outside and I hear bird song, I like to know what bird is making it. And when I see a flower blooming, I just want to know what kind it is. I don't like to just drive by and go, oh, that would look nice. You can enjoy it at that level, but I get more out of it by understanding it. And then as you learn, a lot of times there's really interesting information, like how native people used that particular plant. There's one called flannel bush. It blooms, it's going to be blooming pretty soon. It has big yellow waxy flowers. It's a really hardy shrub. You see it around Alpine Forest and Bear Valley and Golden Hills. There's different places, but it's called flannel bush. An old nickname was called slippery elm, because if you peel the outer bark, it's really mucilaginous. Like you put some water in it, really feels slippery, and they would put that on like pack sores that horses would have. The native people, the Nua, made their strongest cordage from the inner bark fibers of that plant. And so as you begin to learn more about things, it just makes life more interesting. And when you know the names of the mountain peaks, and you can identify trees, you know what kind of plants those are, those animals, you just feel more at home in the world. It's like if you move to a new town and you don't know anything, you don't feel really very at home there. But once you know the names of the streets and people recognize you on the street, and you feel more at home in the world. So that's how I feel about Tehachapi. And so if I can help people that have moved here more recently, or even people that grew up here but just never thought about the differences in the kinds of oak trees, or where turkey vultures come from, or where they go, when you understand more, it just makes you feel more at home in the world. It makes it a more interesting place.
I think we could all take a cue from Jon,
Yeah.
and do a little more of that.
Well, I mean, a lot of the stuff too. I mean, you brought up the Nua or the Kauai Sioux. I mean, I've learned so much about them through your writings and your research, because you've pointed out the language is not spoken very much anymore. It was a sing-song language. There's not a lot of that left, but just kind of, you understand especially their traditions in this land and what they saw initially, and it kind of makes you feel a little more connection to the Tehachapi area when you understand what the Kauai Sioux or the Nua went through.
Yeah, I mean, they had names for springs that have no name today, water sources, or some of the canyons that are scarcely even, you look on a topo map and go, there's no name on that. But the Nua people had names for it. There's a related people, Chemehuevi. They're the closest linguistically. They're also in the Southern Paiute family of tribes, and the language is pretty close to each other. They had these things they call the salt songs, and they would sing them, and they were a verbal map. And they would say where to find salt and water and plants in these 4 state areas, because they would go in Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah. And just by singing these songs, memorizing these songs, it was a map in your head. They had no paper and they didn't have any written maps. But singing this cycle, the salt song cycle, would tell you as you were traveling where you could find water or salt or food and things. So to know that the Nua people ventured all over the Tehachapi Mountains and knew it well and knew what plants they could eat and how to survive, they just were amazingly tenacious and intelligent, resourceful people. And so I just have a huge respect for that. And so it was very difficult to conceive that they, all of their knowledge gained through centuries of living here was useless. So, and of course it wasn't. So I found interesting things like some of the aged Nua women. They told an ethnographer an ethnobotanist named Maurice Zygmunt, who came here in the 30s, they told him that California grizzlies used to eat large amounts of this plant called kuvus. In books, it's called spring gold, but it's kuvus, Lomatium reticulatum. And I wondered about that. I saw that reference in Zygmunt's book that some of the old-timer ladies told him that California grizzlies, and there used to be a lot of California grizzlies in the Tehachapi Mountains. Bear Valley and Bear Mountain are not named for black bears. They're named for California grizzlies. And I wondered if he'd gotten that right, because he didn't speak Nua. He had to have a translator, tribal member who spoke English and Nua, and his informants that he spoke to didn't speak English. So I wondered if they got that right. And then I read that Rocky Mountain grizzlies, when they emerge from hibernation, one of the most important plants they eat is a plant they call biscuit root. And I looked up, and biscuit root is another Lomatium, and it looks just like kuvus. It's a different species, but it's the same genus. And so I go, it was right. Like this oral tradition. And as recently as the 1920s, there was an Indian woman, she's passed away now, but she told me her grandmother remembers seeing a man, Oko Etapanua. He was wearing a loincloth. He was an old Indian man. So the Tehachapi Indian people, some of them were among the last ones to be in a civilized or tamed down. They weren't warlike, but Harold Williams told me, Kauai Sioux elder who's passed away now, a great human being. Harold Williams told me that we were like the tara. That's how they say California quail. You kind of roll the R's like the wing beats of a quail when they get startled. So they say tara. We were like the tara. We just melted away into the hillsides, and they would go to Walker Basin and up into the hills and get away from people when they're being displaced. But there's some way you just have to, it just seems like common sense to think like if people have managed to survive somewhere for thousands of years, they've learned interesting, useful information. So I just try to share that with people.
Nowadays, we go to Albertsons to fill our cart, and if it takes more than 5 minutes to check out, we're not happy. We want to move on.
Yeah, and there's hardly any grizzly bears.
Talk about
getting in your cart.
It's a complete departure from what you just described.
Yeah. And even that history,
crazy?
Even that history too. When you go to talk about just the 20s and 30s with the Indian population, the folks that were still here, the native peoples, that was a big founding of. Go back to the very first 1930 Tehachapi football team, and those majority were Indian kids, and that's where they came up with the name Indians. That's where they started. They were initially the Tehachapi Indians. Eventually Warriors was changed, but that came from the kids on the team. That's who they wanted to be identified as.
Yeah, and monolith, I've always said monolith was like an equalizer, a racial equalizer in a sense, because when you're covered with cement dust at the end of the day, people didn't care as much the color of your skin. I'm not saying that there was no racism, but the first black child that was born in Tehachapi was Laura Patterson, and she was born at Tehachapi Hospital, and her father, Mose, who was a great guy. She had a wonderful mother, Ola Mae Patterson. They came to work. They came from Arkansas, and they came to work at Monolith. There was many of the Latino families in Tehachapi are here because their grandfathers or great-grandfathers came to work at Monolith. There was an Indian camp near there. There was a number of Indian men who worked at Monolith. So it did serve as like an equalizing effect. And Tehachapi had less racial tension than a lot of communities, partially because of Monolith, because they all worked at the same place. They got paid the same amount, and so it had a positive effect of having people working in the same way that the aerospace industry post-World War II in like the San Fernando Valley and that area. Everyone came from somewhere else. They moved there. They worked in aerospace. And so they didn't have the entrenched kind of cliques and ethnic groups like they did back in East Coast cities. And so Monolith being out there, opened and started like 1904 is when they very first started building the facility, and it supplied cement for the aqueduct until about 1912 when it was completed. And then the city of LA kept it, and they made all the cement for the LA Coliseum and some other things, and they sold it in the 1920s. But all through the years, it's just been open. They would hire people who were willing to work hard, and so there was a number of Indian people who worked there, as well as Latinos and some black people and white people.
We even even had that conversation recently with our, we redid when they're redoing the council maps, and the demographer has to use that. And he said, what was this quote, homogenized milk? Mm-hmm. He said, this community is homogenized milk. I don't have one area this is the Latino neighborhood. This is little Saigon. This is Koreatown. He goes, I don't have that here. You're minorities, you're white folks, everybody's in the same neighborhoods. You're all equally represented across, as opposed to being, sort of segregated in a neighborhood. So that was really fairly complimentary, and it makes sense to stick with tradition of what you just pointed out with Monolith.
Yeah. So I know we started this podcast about the 1952 earthquake, but man, we have really covered a broad spectrum, and I already have 5 more podcast ideas.
I was just going to say there'll be a whole series of
Monolith podcast and others.
We were talking about the films that we got sent by Coy Burnett's granddaughter, got sent to City Hall, and I got to get those to John at some point to have him look at them, and they're amazing. And
he used to take the whole crew to Catalina Island once a year. We've got those films.
There's many children, they're adults now, of course, but there's people who grew up in Tehachapi that fondly remember the Catalina trips, courtesy of Coy Burnett and Monolith Portland Cement Company.
Yeah. Amazing.
Good stuff. Tehachapi has really good, deep roots.
Yeah, it's an interesting place.
It sure is.
And literally, like, John and I go back to, 1996, when the Tehachapi News decided to let this knucklehead kid come work at their office as an intern. And John and I and Bill Mead, who owned the place, we didn't have the internet was just out, and there wasn't a lot of you didn't have it at your house. So the office was the only place we'd go and write. And then, so partial of my writing comes from John's influence and Bill Mead's influence. And
well, John, as people are listening and getting, maybe because we do have so many new people here in the community that are getting exposed to this conversation with you for the first time, how can they explore your works? Where are they going to find you?
I'm working on actually 4 books right now. That is one for each season. They're collections of my column, but they're organized in a way, because people have said over the years, you should put your columns in a book. But I go, it wouldn't really appeal to me to just have how would you know to find things? It was just so I've organized them in this detailed outlines, these 4 spring, summer, fall, and winter, and each one covers plants, birds, mammals, history, things that are most appropriate for that season. So that's a work in progress. A lot of them are archived online at Tehachapi News. If you're curious about something like bobcats at your house, or a gray fox or a plant, if you know what the name of it, if you type in pen in hand gray fox, some stories will come up, or the turkey vultures, because that's a whole nother, that should be a podcast in itself. The turkey vulture migration through Tehachapi in the fall, in September and October, more than 30,000 come through, and these birds are from Canada, from Washington State, from Oregon and Northern California, and they all funnel through. They come down the San Joaquin Valley against the west side of the Sierra Nevadas, and then they funnel over through Walker Pass. More than 30,000 go through Walker Pass, and more than 30,000 go through Tehachapi Pass. And we know that because we had vulture counts for 3 years in a row to figure out. So that's a whole other story. But
that'd be great. We're going to do it.
Your columns currently, Tehachapi News and The Loop.
And The Loop, I don't know how far they go back and archived in The Loop, but they're also put on there about the week after they
And you usually write something for each Experience Tehachapi magazine that comes out, and one's coming out soon. Yeah. Is there anything to preview in that? Do you have anything coming out in that folks look forward to?
Yeah.
Don't talk about the dumps.
No
maps.
No. But there'll just be more. I try to. There's just interesting things about Tehachapi that people a lot of times aren't aware of, and sometimes when things change, like Key and I were talking earlier about how the only thing constant is change. Things keep changing, and it's how quickly you forget things that used to be part of I don't know if Corey, do you remember? Did they still have bonfires when you were a little kid?
Yeah, we had the homecoming bonfire where I don't know when they stopped it. Probably after our year, because we usually had the tendency to elevate things. But yeah, that was a huge tradition.
I remember being a little kid, you could feel it from 100 feet away, this giant bonfire, and they would have competition among the grades, mostly the juniors and seniors, who could contribute the most scrap wood for this bonfire. One time, this friend of mine, he's older than me, but they had gotten the outhouse from the quarry up at Monolith. Well, it was still in use. They had taken it.
That's why they stopped these bonfires, John.
But they did end up having to pay to replace that that outhouse that they threw on top of the fire. The senior class did win that year, thanks to
There
him.
you go. I think a lot of that got changed. I want to say after the Texas A&M bonfire tragedy, when somebody was on the pile and the pile collapsed and the student died.
Students,
I think that's sort of like had a ramification sort of nationwide. Where people are like,
and even after and when California suffers from a year-round fire season now, it just doesn't seem like the most prudent thing to do. Like,
in our winds,
we're gonna have a giant bonfire.
We
have a bonfire every year at the 4th of July after the fireworks.
Yeah, we do. Usually it's an aerial show and a ground show at the same time.
We try to limit that. Last few years has been pretty good.
Kirk County Fire, though, is going to help us out this year. We're going to have
right.
a prescribed burn before the event.
Yes,
so
we'll be
let's
good.
Keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Well, what a fascinating discussion today. 70 years ago, on July 21st, we had a devastating earthquake here in Tehachapi that's kind of changed the destiny of Tehachapi, and it's become what it is today. And it's much safer, as you talked about, as we change codes based on historic events, things that we lived through. So we're a much safer community.
Yeah. We are, and it's been an interesting conversation, but kudos to the Heritage League right downtown on Green Street. They have commissioned this film they're putting together, and it'll be available for purchase, I think, later this year or maybe early next year. But it's a real production that they're putting together here, and they have actors, and I think it's going to be worth purchasing and helping out.
And recollections of people who lived through it.
Interviews.
We saw that, like, tick tock, like the time was growing short for some of our elders who were around and lived through it. Like Pat Gracie was a switchboard operator, and Pat is
Del Troy, lots of people,
Yeah, and that's, we bring up the history part too. We think about it, a couple years back, you brought up the fact that people spend an entire summer living outside. Immediately I'm like, wow, history repeats itself, because like 2 years ago we spent the entire summer living outside. We ate outside, did everything outside because that was what COVID forced us to do, and then even use that example when we did our sort of reopening, downtown on Green Street last year. We kind of reopened the economy. It was like, I made that comment on this spot here, 70 years ago, we had to rebuild. Right. And we did. And so I think you see that history repeat itself in Tehachapi with just amongst the will of the people and what they're able to do when they contribute and rebuild.
We're very resilient.
Yeah. Tehachapi people are resilient and optimistic.
Yeah.
Keep it that way.
Well, I think with that being said, we'll leave that. I think we'll end it right here. And then, John, I want to give you the open invitation to come back so we can have future discussions.
Yeah.
And we'll find some more topics, or maybe you'll throw one to us. Say, hey, this is coming up. And maybe it's what you talked about before we even started recording, the 150th anniversary that's around the corner. I mean, that's just 4 years away, as we've heard from Keith Sakowitz over at the depot, and the history of the railroad and interesting timings of things that are going on.
Yeah, because Tehachapi in its current location was established in 1876, so exactly 100 years after the United States was officially established, so it's easy to remember. I was born the same year as the first mountain festival, so it's easy for me to remember, like, which mountain festival is this? I know.
I love it.
Well, guys, anything else that we want to mention before we close?
I don't think I have anything other than thank you very much,
Yeah.
John.
Oh, you're
Appreciate
welcome.
your
Thanks.
time.
It was fun.
Yeah. Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
time.
Yeah, appreciate the time, John. Well, folks, if you've got a question, maybe it's for John or one of us, send it to media@tehachapicityhall.com. We're happy to get that to John, or maybe it's a topic you'd like to hear him discuss with us more. What's the idea? What's the Tehachapi history that we want to know about? And then we'll bring John back in here. And I love, in coordinating with John, he goes, I don't use a scheduler, so we're going to have to touch base a few times leading up to it just to.
John doesn't keep a calendar. I texted Key and I said, I was in a budget meeting. I said, text me when John gets here, because I'm not gonna go over away for him. So when he's actually in the studio, you text me and let me know.
And that's what we did. All right, folks, we appreciate your time here on Tehachapi. John, once again, thank you for taking the time to come in and sharing the stories of our history here in Tehachapi. It's so rich and interesting and filled with people that just have made this place, and the names continue on. So we appreciate the time.
You're welcome, Keith. Thank you.
And folks, again, media@tehachapicityhall.com. We appreciate your time, and we'll catch you again soon on Tehachapi.
Tehachapod is a conversation about Tehachapi designed for the people who live here or who would like to know more about this mountaintop community. If you have a question you would like answered, email media@tehachapicityhall.com. We will try to answer it on a future episode of Tehachapod.